Núna rétt á eftir ætla ég að tala við David Howden. Hann það viðtal fer fram í gegnum Skype. Hann skrifaði bók ásamt öðrum manni íslenska efnahagshrunið sem heitir Deep Freeze. Philip Bakers og David Howden eru hagfræðingar. David frá Bandaríkjunum, Philip frá Þýskalandi. Þeir eru starfandi báðir sem háskólakennarar í Madrid. David þar við St. Louis University sem bandarískur háskóli en með útibú í Madrid. Þeir eru höfundar bókar sem nefnist Deep Freeze, Iceland Economic Collapse. Hún fjallar náttúrulega hrunið á Íslandi. Þeir leita ástæðuna fyrir hruninu og horfa meðal annars á hlut stjórnvalda og Seðlabankans. Við ætlum að taka hér viðtal við David Howden. Það fer fram í gegnum Skype. Þetta það býður ekki upp á fullkomið myndgæði Skypeið, ekki ennþá, en þetta er náttúrulega eitthvað, þetta er ódýr, góð leið til að tala við fólk í útlöndum og eitthvað sem verður notað meira í sjónvarpi í framtíðinni frekar en rándýrar gervihnatta útsendingar. David, welcome to Silver Ales.
Hi there, thanks for having me.
I was going to ask you a few questions about your book. It's Deep Freeze. You are describing the failure of Iceland's economic system, banking system in 2008, and I would like just to start off by asking you to give me a general picture of what your book is about.
Well, what me and my co-author Philip Bagus try looking at is what are the causes of Iceland's financial crisis and what are some of the consequences of it. So when we look at the cause side of the situation, it's really the same as we have everywhere else in the world. We have an overextended banking system, we have incredible amounts of debt, and then we have eventually reductions in revenue to pay off those debts. What really sets Iceland apart from every other country in the world and why we wanted to focus on it so much is it's really unique in two ways. The first is, of course, that the banking sector is so large relative to the size of the economy. And then also the role that foreign-denominated debts, foreign-denominated mortgages, et cetera, really played in propagating the crisis once late 2008 rolled around. In particular, in doing this, we really lay the blame on two sides of the story. So on the one side, we think, we would almost assuredly say that the Central Bank of Iceland had just set an interest rate policy too low for too long. So interest rates were incredibly low, and of course you ended up with a situation where Icelanders were borrowing incredible amounts, tremendous amounts of debt with these low interest rates. Iceland's case is a little bit unusual for foreigners because interest rates don't seem that low in nominal terms compared to what we're used to in the rest of the world. But Iceland is, of course, a high inflation country, so people were paying incredibly low or even nearly negative real rates. The second cause that we really focus on is the role of the foreign-denominated borrowing, all the foreign-denominated debts that people had. In particular, we look at why was it that maybe so many people took on mortgages denominated in foreign currencies so that they could take advantage of lower interest rates. In normal times or in conventional economic situations, you could take a foreign-denominated mortgage, let's say with a low interest rate. So an Icelander could take on a Japanese yen-denominated mortgage, for example, and pay a really low yen mortgage rate. But this wouldn't really matter in real terms because they would expect that the Icelandic kroner would devalue in terms against the yen, so the total interest charge that you would pay would balance out in this way. Or what you would gain by paying a lower interest rate, you would lose by paying a higher exchange rate at some time in the future. The problem in Iceland was the currency never devalued, so of course throughout the whole of the 2000s you saw a strengthening kroner, which made it incredibly cheap for Icelanders to continue borrowing in foreign-denominated currencies. And this is really the crux of the problem that we try to focus on. Why was it that what would normally stabilize the situation, weakening kroner compared to other currencies in the world, was it that it didn't devalue? Or why was it that we didn't see weakness in that particular market? And then why was it that then allowed everybody to just borrow securely in these foreign funds and not worry about losing their shirts on it?
So are we looking at a failure of policies?
It's a failure of policy in two ways, domestically and then also foreign. So on the one side, when we look at why there was such a low and stable exchange, or why there was such a stable exchange rate for Icelandic kroner over the whole period, we look at some international organizations. So we say there was a lot of influential international organizations like the IMF coming in throughout all of the 2000s, promising exchange rate of stability, promising that the Icelandic krona would be maintained at a certain value. Of course, when the krona floated in the early 2000s, there was worries about what would actually happen. To assuage these fears, the IMF, among other people, came in and said, don't worry, if there's a situation where this currency is devaluing, we'll interact, or we'll intervene in this market to maintain stability. So we had this interaction from foreign or some international organizations maintaining stability. On the domestic side, we saw a fairly large amount of foreign currency being invested in Iceland, and I think the problem, or where this actually arose, was more on the Central Bank of Iceland's side. The Icelandic Central Bank is unique in the world in that it offers deposit schemes on deposit insurance schemes for money that's deposited on the island. And it's unique because it's not only what they insure is not only your domestic kroner accounts, it's also your foreign accounts. So if you're a foreigner or if you have foreign currency, you can take it to Iceland, you can deposit it there. You're assured by the Central Bank of Iceland that they'll pay you out if anything happens to the bank, so they'll cover any bankruptcies. Or that was what was in theory anyway. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, you can take advantage of investing in Iceland at these higher interest rates, which the Icelandic economy supported over this time, at least higher compared to what the rest of the world was offering. The Central Bank of Iceland, in this regard, it's one of the only countries in the world to be the group in the economy, or the organization, which offers offers insurance rather on these deposit accounts. And generally, it's directly done through the government, and the reason they do this is the government, although it has deep pockets, doesn't have the ability to just print up money to fund these accounts if they go bankrupt. The central bank has, as your institution which prints money in the economy, if anything goes wrong with a bank, in theory, they can just print up money and supply it to these deposit holders to make them whole again. Now, as a result, when we look at some of the incentives that are involved, generally governments that enact their own deposit insurance schemes, they generally enforce some amount of restrictions on the bank, or they try to make them act a little bit more prudently than they otherwise would. If the bank goes bankrupt, they're going to lose money. In the Central Bank of Iceland's case, there's no real cost to them. If a bank goes bankrupt, you just print up Icelandic kroner to pay off the debts. Now, this is in theory. The only problem is they guaranteed the foreign funds as well. And, of course, Iceland doesn't have the ability to print up yen or Swiss francs or pounds. So you run into a problem of insolvency not only at the bank level, but also going up into the central bank and then eventually the government level as well by guaranteeing all of these funds that individuals have.
But at the same time, the government and the central bank allowed the banks to really become too big to fail.
That's right. That's right. I think it was actually a two-pronged approach. So you had the central bank under David Oddsson is guaranteeing the banking sector, and in particular your big three, to act irresponsibly, to take on huge amounts of risk, to not be worried that your risks are going to go wrong or that you're going to lose money in the future because they're going to backstop you. And at the same time, you have a lot of political interactions between the Central Bank of Iceland and the government. In most countries in the world, and as a general rule, or even the rule, we suggest that central banks be fully separate or fully independent of their governments. We don't like political interference with the money supply or the monetary economy of a country. And in Iceland's case, we didn't really see any separation, and I think it's obvious now that there was incredible influences between the political sphere and the Central Bank of Iceland and vice versa. And I think the two of these working together is really what promoted and propagated this extra large banking system to really develop.
So the central bank really and the government, they were underwriting this system, which was in a way bound to fail.
I would say at this point it's difficult to separate the Central Bank of Iceland from the government. I think it's almost, while in most countries it's operationally independent, in Iceland's case it's really part and parcel of the government. They're inseparable.
But shouldn't they have stopped the banks much earlier, at a much earlier stage?
They could have done that. I'm not sure why they didn't. I'm not sure if they realized there was really a problem going on, or maybe the benefits looked too good to be true. So it could have been that Iceland's economy was tremendously booming throughout the mid-2000s, and I don't think anybody wants to take away the punch bowl while the times are good. So I think there's a lack of enforcement on the side of the government to say, well, enough is enough. Maybe we need to start curtailing some of these guarantees. The other part is that the guarantees are made in the past, And of course, then the mentality or the actions of bankers change once the incentive structures change. So as soon as the bank guaranteed all of these borrowing schemes, all of these investments in foreign currency, it's incredibly hard to change that on a dime. It takes time for bankers to readjust the way that they think and the way that they process business.
But
so if you do the